When we think of war, we often picture epic battles, grand strategies, and moments of heroism that change the course of history. We remember the names of generals, the dates of decisive victories, and the black and white photos of triumphant soldiers. But behind these headlines and historical records lies a different story, one that is far less glamorous and far more human. This is the story of the ordinary soldier for whom war was not about glory, but about survival. It was a daily struggle against discomfort, confusion, fear, and a relentless environment that tested the very limits of human endurance. The soldiers of the world wars faced challenges that most of us today can barely imagine, and these experiences shaped not just their own lives, but entire generations to come. Let's start with the most basic of struggles: living conditions. The battlefields of World War I and II were not clean, organized places. They were chaotic landscapes of mud, craters, and ruin. Soldiers were often crammed into trenches, which became muddy, water-filled pits infested with rats. During the First World War, men stood for hours, sometimes even days, in knee-deep freezing water. This constant exposure led to a painful condition called trench foot, where their feet would swell, turn numb, and sometimes decay, all because they couldn't take off their wet boots and socks. Even when there was a lull in the fighting, the environment itself was an enemy. Rain turned the ground into a thick, inescapable mud that could swallow men and equipment. Summers brought swarms of flies and mosquitoes. And in the winter, the biting cold froze everything, from their drinking water to the very ground they slept on. Then there was the food or the lack of it. Soldiers didn't get to enjoy home-cooked meals. Their diet was brutally simple, repetitive, and often barely edible. Think canned corned beef, biscuits so hard they were nicknamed tooth dullers, and thin watery soups. Fresh food was a luxury few ever saw. The supply lines that brought these meager rations were constantly under threat. They could be cut off by enemy attacks, blocked by terrible weather, or simply break down. This meant many soldiers marched for miles, carrying heavy gear, all on an empty stomach. Hunger was a constant companion, gnawing at their strength and morale. Of course, the most pervasive feeling on the front lines was fear. Every single day was a gamble with death. A soldier could be alive one moment, chatting with a friend, and gone the next, often without any warning. The enemy was always watching. Snipers could be hiding in distant trees or the shells of ruined buildings, ready to pick off anyone who was careless. Artillery shells rained down unpredictably, their terrifying whistle followed by a deafening explosion that tore apart the earth and everything on it. Then there were the gas attacks, a silent, creeping horror that filled the air with poison. Soldiers had to scramble to put on their gas masks, which made breathing difficult, blurred their vision, and filled them with a claustrophobic panic. Even the nights offered little peace. Sleep was constantly interrupted by the sound of distant explosions and the tremors that shook the ground. Nightmares were a common plague, replaying the horrors of the day. This constant state of alert led to another relentless enemy: exhaustion. War doesn't operate on a 9-to-5 schedule. There were no weekends off. Soldiers marched for miles on end, carrying packs that weighed a ton. They spent countless hours digging trenches, repairing fortifications, and standing guard through long, cold nights. Rest was a luxury, not a guarantee. Many soldiers learned to sleep sitting up in the mud, their helmets still on, ready to jump to their feet at the slightest alarm. The human body can only take so much stress and fatigue. It wasn't uncommon for soldiers to collapse not from a bullet, but simply from sheer bone-deep exhaustion. Their bodies just gave out. And if the enemy's weapons didn't get you, disease might. In the crowded, unsanitary conditions of the camps and trenches, sickness spread like wildfire. Lice were a constant torment, living in the seams of dirty uniforms and blankets, causing intense itching and spreading diseases like trench fever. Dysentery, influenza, and other infections ran rampant, claiming thousands of lives. Medical help was often rudimentary and overwhelmed. Supplies were limited, and doctors and nurses worked around the clock in makeshift field hospitals, sometimes forced to perform amputations without proper anesthesia. Simply surviving an injury often came down to pure luck and timing. Beyond the physical suffering, the war inflicted deep emotional wounds. Soldiers watched their friends die right beside them. They saw unimaginable horrors on the battlefield, often helpless to do anything about it. This led to a profound sense of guilt for many survivors. They couldn't shake the feeling that they should have done more to save a friend, or they questioned why they were the ones who lived when so many others did not. This burden, what we now call survivor's guilt, was an invisible scar that many carried with them for the rest of their lives. Communication with home was another source of constant anxiety. Letters were slow to arrive, if they arrived at all, and were heavily censored. Soldiers spent months, sometimes years, not knowing if their families were safe, especially if they came from towns that were being bombed or had been invaded. They carried photos of their loved ones in their pockets, reminders of a happier life that felt a world away. These small treasures were a source of comfort, but also a source of immense pain and homesickness. Perhaps the deepest and most misunderstood challenge was the psychological damage. At the time, conditions like PTSD were not well understood. Soldiers suffering from the intense trauma of combat were often diagnosed with shell shock. They experienced debilitating nightmares, uncontrollable tremors, severe anxiety, and sudden panic. Some were rendered unable to speak. Others couldn't control their emotions. Instead of receiving sympathy and care, many were tragically misunderstood. They were sometimes accused of cowardice, told to be a man, or ordered to just get back to the fighting, even as their minds were breaking under the strain. They were expected to be unbreakable machines, but they were human beings pushed far beyond their limits. When the wars finally ended and the soldiers returned home, their struggles were far from over. Coming back to civilian life presented a whole new set of problems. How could they explain the things they had seen and done to people who hadn't been there? Many found it impossible to feel normal again. Everyday sounds like a car backfiring or a door slamming could trigger flashbacks to the sound of gunfire. Crowds made them feel anxious and trapped. They often felt a profound sense of disconnection, even from their own families who couldn't possibly understand the world they had just left behind. And for those who came back with physical injuries, missing limbs, blindness, or chronic pain, the war was a daily, inescapable reality. Yet, amid all this suffering, something incredible emerged: camaraderie. In the trenches, soldiers formed bonds that were stronger than steel. Friendship became a lifeline, a crucial tool for survival. They shared their meager rations, their stories, and rare moments of laughter in the face of despair. They looked out for each other, supported each other, and gave each other the strength to face another day. These friendships often lasted a lifetime because only those who had lived through the same hell could truly understand one another. The troubles faced by soldiers were so much more than just physical hardship. The war tested their minds, their spirits, and their hearts. It forced boys to become men overnight. They left their homes full of youthful optimism and returned as profoundly changed individuals, carrying burdens both visible and invisible. Their sacrifice wasn't just made on the battlefield. It was made in every single moment they endured the cold, the hunger, the fear, and the loss. So today, when we remember these soldiers, let's look past the old photographs of uniformed figures. Let's remember that they were ordinary people farmers, factory workers, clerks, and students who were thrust into the most extraordinary and terrible circumstances. Their real courage wasn't just in fighting the enemy, but in the quiet, daily act of surviving. Understanding their struggle helps us to cherish peace all the more. It reminds us that the true cost of war is not measured in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in the human lives, the human experiences, and the memories that last forever. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories that honor our shared history.